Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, wherever in the world you may be joining us from today. My name is Francesco Del Carpio, and I am the CFL York Operations Coordinator. I would like to officially open the fifth session of the Climate Change, Emergencies, and Cultural Heritage Speaker Series, which is being presented in partnership with Heritage Ottawa with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge and recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territory upon which our campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. The area is known as Toronto and has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and that the territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. As this is an online event, our participants may be joining from various locations, and I strongly encourage you to learn about the traditional land upon which you are located. With this, I welcome our moderator, our speaker, and our participants from around the world. Welcome to our webinar. Without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce our moderator, Catherine Spencer-Ross. Catherine Spencer-Ross has served on the Heritage Ottawa Board since 2012 and was elected as president in 2022. Heritage Ottawa is an award-winning, volunteer-driven, not-for-profit organization that advocates for the protection and stewardship of Ottawa's built heritage and cultural places at both the municipal and federal levels. Catherine began her working life as an officer in the Canadian Armed Forces and spent more than 35 years in the federal public service. She worked as an architectural historian with Parks Canada before moving to more policy-related work in various government departments. She retired at the executive level during the pandemic. Catherine has lived in Germany, the United States, and Spain, and is an avid traveler. Much of her travel takes her to World Heritage sites around the globe. Thank you, Catherine, very much for being here today and moderating today's session. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Francesco. It's now my great pleasure to introduce our speaker for this session. Dr. Mario Santana Quintero is a professor at Carleton University, Ottawa, in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering, cross-appointed with the Israeli School of Architecture and Urbanism. He's also the director of the NSERC CREATE program Heritage Engineering, based at the Carleton Immersive Media Studio Lab. He's a guest professor at the Raymond Lemaire International Center for Conservation at the University of Leuven. Along with his academic activities, Mario serves as Secretary General of ICOMOS and is a member of the Association of Preservation Technology College of Fellows. He's also past president of the ICOMOS Scientific Committee on Heritage Documentation. In addition, he has been a Getty Conservation Institute scholar. Mario collaborates extensively in international projects in the field of heritage documentation for the Getty Conservation Institute, for UNESCO, the Arab Regional Center for World Heritage, Bahrain Department of Culture and Tourism in Abu Dhabi, ICROM, World Monuments Fund, UNDP, Welfare Association, and Korea's Cultural Heritage Agency. Mario's presentation on climate emergency impacting UNESCO World Heritage is timely, given the announcement today from COP28 of the launch of an international coalition of UN member states aimed at building political momentum for the recognition of culture as a uniquely powerful force and positive resource for a more effective climate change policy. Before I turn the session over to Mario, please note that he has agreed to take some questions at the end of his presentation. I ask that you submit your questions through the Q&A function. And with that, Mario, I turn the virtual floor over to you.
Thank you, Catherine. Let me just open my PowerPoint and put it on full screen. And then I'm going, so given that we have the Zoom window, okay, great. So good morning, good afternoon, good night, or good very early to people connecting from different parts of the world. And thank you for coming to my presentation. I would like to thank everyone, in particular the organizers and, Francesco, Ali, Courage, and actually also Rosa and Catherine for your kind introduction. And I feel very privileged to be able to talk to you under this platform provided by CIFAL at York University and one of the associated training centers of UNITAR. So in my presentation today, I'm going to be talking about, obviously, the UNESCO World Heritage Convention, climate emergency impacting, and I will be looking through the eyes of one of an academic like myself, also as a member of ICOMOS. I would like to just to correct a few things, because I apologize, because I should have sent to Catherine an updated bio, because I actually finished my term as Secretary General of ICOMOS last September. So I'm the immediate past Secretary General, and basically now I am, looking into I am kind of in that retirement phase of ICOMOS, but still very engaged with the organization. So I am a faculty member of the Carleton Immersive Media Studio at Carleton University, and we are an independent research lab that focuses on the use of digital technologies for the conservation of cultural heritage in many facets. And we have had the privilege to work around the world in the last 12 years in different places. Some of them World Heritage sites, some of them not. And in those sites, we have worked at, recording the site, found condition. We have worked at scales of site level, an entire archaeological site. We have worked at component levels, meaning, buildings or specific features of the sites. And also we have worked in attributes. In attributes, dealing a little bit with World Heritage, deals basically with those elements that contribute to the outstanding universal value. And in this particular case, we were able to work on the Tomb of Nefertari in Egypt. And we have collaborated with different organizations. Catherine already mentioned some of them. One of our strategic collaborators has been the Getty Conservation Institute, in which we have been able to collaborate in different projects around the world. And I would also be showing you some pictures of one of our projects in Chiribiquete in Colombia, and that project has been in collaboration with the Instituto Colombiano of Anthropology and History. And this is Chiribiquete. Is a wonderful mixed site, natural site, cultural site, with ancient rock panels, and we have been able to collaborate with the Colombian government in the recording of these remote pictorial places of rock art, using different digital technologies to assess their condition, besides understanding the importance of these various sites that are not accessible to common people. And we have been using technologies such as photogrammetry and 3D scanning and remote sensing to be able to locate them in their geographic position, and also to create records that could be served as condition assessment of those particular sites. We have also worked in areas of seismic action. This is a project that we conducted in 2017 in the Nyatapola Temple in Nepal, in which we were trying to understand, every single structural component of this temple, to understand the impact of the seismic reaction of the earthquake in 2016. We are very specialized in the recording of decorated surfaces. This is one of the projects we were working a long time ago in Bagan, in Myanmar, to record the condition of these temples, also affected by the seismic reactions. Also a project with the Getty Conservation Institute. And this is also from 2017, a project that we conducted in the Tomb of Nefertari, to be able to record the condition of this tomb that has been highly impacted by ongoing visitation of people to see the wonders of this particular site. And this is another project from Cyprus, Paphos, in which we were recording the archaeological remains and mosaics of this very important World Heritage Site in Cyprus for its conservation and management plans. This is again Myanmar. We have also worked on modeling to understand the seismic reaction of different temples in the majestic site of Bagan in that country. So just one quote before I start, and I thank Catherine to mention this coalition of culture as a positive bias now announced by COP28. And I think it's important to mention that tangible and intangible heritage, as well as knowledge, enhance resilience and offer time-tested, low-carbon, circular, and generative technologies. Sometimes we look at very specific modern technologies and we kind of neglect, the understanding of those traditional techniques that might offer some light of how to mitigate, to adapt to the issues of climate change. Conservation is obviously an activity very important to us, in particular in ICOMOS, in which we look at managing change of those particular sites. And obviously, climate change is all about what kind of specific impacts are going to be happening on World Heritage sites. The world's cultural heritage is magnificent. I have been, as I said, I have been blessed to be able to work in different sites. This is just few pics from sites such as Bagan in Myanmar, or the temples of Angkor Wat in Cambodia, the magnificent pictorial images of the Tomb of Nefertari in Egypt, or Machu Picchu, who hasn't been impressed with these archaeological remains. But obviously, World Heritage is under siege, not only by climate change, but other aspects that could be to one extent or the other also linked with the issues of climate emergency, such as abandonment, disaster and conflicts, visitor pressure, and neglect. But cultural heritage is not only those tangible aspects. Also very important and also affected by climate change are those immovable aspects, associations to that space that we call the sites, and also, for instance, underwater cultural heritage that in many aspects is not very easy to identify as it's covered by water. I was very puzzled by, this relationship between the World Heritage Convention and the Intangible World Heritage Convention, in which in one given, obviously the World Heritage Convention was created in 1972. The Intangible Cultural Heritage Convention was created and launched in the 2000s. So we have this definition of site, sites, this work of man or combined works of nature and man, but these tangible aspects such as building or archaeological sites. But then we have, the intangible cultural heritage that has all these other dimensions, but it's always associated to what they call the cultural space. And how can we, define a site that has both aspects and how they are affected by climate change? UNESCO already covers, the protection of cultural heritage in a very comprehensive manner. We have several conventions. Here I'm only listing 7 of them. Obviously, in this presentation, as I said, I will be dealing mostly with the World Cultural Natural Convention, the World Heritage Convention, but obviously the safeguarding of intangible cultural heritage, the protection of underwater cultural heritage, the second protocol for sites, affected by conflict are also very important conventions that we need to take into account. A historic place is, according to Parks Canada, is a structure, building, groups of buildings, district, landscape, archaeological sites, or a place that has been formally recognized for its heritage value. These heritage places are composed by attributes, as we call them in World Heritage, or character-defining elements, and some of the examples of those can be the materials, the forms, the location, the spatial configurations, but also, as I said, those associated cultural meanings, the intangible aspect of the site. So we have increasing threats, and we need to respond to those threats, or also we need to adapt. And we were talking about that briefly, and I will show you in a slide in a second. Also, a very important concept to deal with World Heritage and also with existing sites or historic buildings is the issues of embodied carbon and operational carbon, and how can we decarbonize our current economy. And I think that heritage offers a big opportunity here, and I will be talking about that later in this presentation. So heritage places can be called sustainable. They have already that embodied carbon, embodied energy. They are made of durable materials, indigenous materials of the region. They can be repaired to a certain degree easily. They have this long life, long fit, and this passive survivability. And this is from Jean Caroon, one architect from Boston that mentioned how heritage places can actually be sustainable. Now, dealing with World Heritage, I was always impressed by the Nubian campaign that triggered, the creation of the convention, the safeguard of these temples in the 60s by UNESCO that were threatened by, the construction of a dam, and this construction of a dam generated, to generate energy for the south of Egypt, and the countries, Sudan, both and Egypt, represented, this threat to the World Heritage sites there, and these sites were moved to an alternative location to be safeguarded. But equally, what is not very known to people is basically the impact of the displacement of Nubian people by this, construction of the dam. So on a certain stage, we have always talked about World Heritage as being, this very important aspect of our humanity. But sometimes we have neglected the importance of people who are directly affected by, the World Heritage. And actually, World Heritage is not, this kind of museum that we visit that is concealed in a building. World Heritage is all around us, like people like me who live in Ottawa, in Canada. We have the Rideau Canal. People that live in Quebec City, Quebec is a World Heritage site. So it's basically a city where, we do our daily activities. And how can we, dislocate the fact of World Heritage being part of all of us, even when we visit sites such as Venice or other places. These are places where people live and settle and have their livelihood. So the UNESCO World Heritage Convention has been probably the most important tool to protect our cultural and natural heritage. It has detailed procedures. It integrates the concepts of nature and culture. It's one of the most relevant international instruments, and it has been the catalyst to make a movement to protect those sites internationally. World Heritage deals with this concept of OUV. I think some of my predecessors in the webinar sessions already talked about this concept. Outstanding universal value is based on criteria. Criteria are based on descriptions. These criteria categorize the importance of those sites to be of outstanding universal value. Then when we look at sites in the World Heritage Convention are protected by a boundary. So they have a World Heritage property boundary. This boundary is again protected by a buffer zone. And then we have a wider setting. And it's very important to understand that protection of the attributes of a site need to be under these three aspects: property, buffer zone, and wider setting. And climate change can basically affect these three different scales of protection. And I will be mentioning that also a little bit later in my presentation. To be World Heritage, you need to meet at least one criteria: the site. It needs to meet integrity and authenticity, and the sites need to have protection and management. But what about if those sites will be affected in the future, and some of those aspects of authenticity and integrity will be affected by climate change? Would this mean that the site has no longer outstanding universal value? These are some of the aspects that we have to deal now in the future. When we look at UNESCO World Heritage, we have activities such as tentative listing, denomination, when the sites are included on the World Heritage list. We have reactive monitoring, periodic monitoring. We have sites that are listed in the endangered list. And then obviously we have interpretation and presentation. How can we make all this climate change part of all these activities? This is from an article of Lin and other authors. And here you can see the amount of World Heritage sites to 2022. Now in 2023, we're already talking about nearly 1,200 sites around the world. We see that there is mostly cultural sites, although if we look at the size, of both marine and terrestrial natural sites, we have about 3.5 million square kilometers of total area protected, in which 60% of those are marine. And I think that these are some of the aspects that we don't really look into statistics. How much of the world is actually World Heritage? and what type of typologies we have. And then when you look at the map of World Heritage, you will see that most sites are obviously located in the global north, such as Europe, Asia, north of Asia, and Northern America. But then in other continents, we don't have that bigger representation of sites, but that doesn't mean actually that places in those particular areas of the world are not worth to be deemed World Heritage. Coming from the UNESCO World Heritage Convention, we see that there are many factors affecting the property, not only climate change and severe weather events. We also have social and cultural uses of the site, management and institutional factors. We have development, pollution, local conditions affecting the physical fabric, physical resource extraction, soil ecological or geological events. Obviously, some of these elements are also very linked with climate change, but also should not be neglected when we look at sites. So in climate change, last winter, for people like me and Catherine living in Ottawa, we were not able to skate in the skateway of the Rideau Canal, which is a World Heritage Site. And this, we can see how obviously the impact of climate change is affecting the way we look at places. And I was just talking to Catherine that at Carleton University, one of my colleagues, Sean Kenny, is doing some research on how to prolong the skating of the canal. And one of the conclusions is that actually we should get colder weather, which we knew already from the start, right? So are we able to give up skating on the canal? And this is a question that we have to ask all over the world. Are we able to come to terms that World Heritage Sites are going to disappear? Some of them are going to be heavily affected, and those effects of climate change would actually diminish the idea of World Heritage. So how can we come into terms with this idea? And I was reading that article of Lynn, as I was saying, and this is one of my major questions that I want to give you in this humble presentation. So we see, obviously, that temperature is one of the aspects that is rising, and this is affecting everything. How can we reduce temperature? Well, threats to World Heritage intensify weather conditions, accelerated freeze-thaw cycles like we have in Ottawa, higher humidity levels increase the growth of mold, and frequent disasters have much more devastating effects on historic places. Now, what are the gaps of how can actually heritage be protected from climate change? For instance, we have seen that there is a lack of climate action methodologies and policy frameworks that actually look at heritage. For instance, some of these methodologies often characterize the need for transformative action as a social and technological problem, and some approaches tend to ignore actually the cultural and traditional contributions that can be provided. The general absence of the discourse of cultural heritage in the climate sector of climate change, science is obvious. Actually, heritage experts are very well positioned to provide contributions to climate change. And we feel that there is a lost opportunity, often greatest in cities and regions with ambitious climate actions pledges. According to the Climate Heritage Network, is one of the organizations that we are members at Carleton, and also ICOMOS is the secretariat of the Climate Heritage. Here in this graph, you can see how the contribution, of building and building operations have a great impact on heritage, and those are the things that we probably need to focus. If we see this document from the Global Alliance for Buildings and Constructions, obviously, nearly 80% of the global emissions of the built environment are actually by, the actions of human, By 2030, the built environment should have half of these emissions. And how can we actually prevent this to happen? So there are 10 principles for effective action for adaptation of the building sector to climate change. 1, to act now. Second, to consider a systematic integration of the measures to adapt across the entire value chain. Consider the process, implement adaptation and mitigation in tandem, understand data, understand scale. How can we consider some nature-based solutions where, heritage and traditional techniques could help? and promote that just adaptation of the building sector, enable adaptation of the building sector and fit adaptation measures to the local context. And I will be talking about that a little bit more. In relation to our country, obviously, Canada is warming up twice as fast as any other region of Earth. These fast changes will transform completely our physical environment and threaten our architectural heritage and infrastructure. We have vulnerability, which reflects to the sensitivity of changes of places and refers to the specific features of attributes that are vulnerable to those changes. Sensitivity refers to how easily the values of the site can be irreparably damaged, and a sensitive site is one of those features, and their attributes can be easily be transformed by a wide number of factors, which can be easily identified. So this coming from the ICOMOS, document that I will refer in a couple of seconds, the change over time document that we launched in 2019, how can we work on that aspect of resilience? How can the site survive those impacts and recover and embrace that change throughout the future? And then obviously the word adaptation has a lot of meaning to us, but how can we, acknowledge that some sites will disappear, but also how can we adapt using traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples and local knowledge systems? So when we talk about adaptation, what is it that we need to adapt? Who or what will adapt, and how will that adaptation occur in the future? What will be the adaptive capacity of that particular site? For instance, how can we, if we have a specific traditional construction techniques that are highly affected by climate change, how can we improve the maintenance? For instance, one of the aspects that I feel very strongly is that we talk a lot about, conservation of World Heritage Sites without actually understanding what the traditional construction techniques are there and how can we improve their use. So in planning for loss and damage, we will have loss in many particular sites. How can we recognize, how can we potentially record those sites that will be lost forever? And how can we adapt those sites that will remain there from the aspect? So in one, I have been talking about different concepts. One of the ones I kind of refer a lot in my teaching is, understanding risk, understanding the level of hazard, the vulnerability of site, and the exposure to these aspects. So to calculate risk and impact, risk is the potential of a damage to occur. The hazard plus the vulnerability plus the exposure is the potential impact. For instance, if we look at flood risk in a coastal town, the vulnerability, well, can we build a flood barrier or other actions that stop water? What is the hazard? Obviously, the increasing rainfall. And the exposure, well, maybe we need to move particular aspects to higher grounds. Another aspect that is really important in talking about climate is climate justice. What are the ethical considerations that we need to see alongside the protection of environment and natural sciences, where we also respect the people that inherently live in those sites and are equally affected by climate change? One of my favorite techniques that James Cook University has been developing in Australia is the Climate Vulnerability Index, which systematically assesses the climate change vulnerability of World Heritage properties based on a risk assessment approach that is very different from others. One, because it looks at the outstanding universal value as a central concept, but also because it involves the community vulnerability on the aspects of economy, social, and cultural dependencies of that community to the World Heritage property and their adaptive capacity to cope with this climate change. So I think that this interaction between, the values of the site, but how the site is important to that community's vulnerability in the verge of climate change is a good aspect. So here you can see this, one of the charts that the Climate Vulnerability Index is using to understand the impact of climate change to world heritage, in which we have the exposure, the sensitivity, the potential impact, the adaptive capacity, but also undertaking the outstanding universal value vulnerability and its relation with the outcome in terms of economic, social, and cultural aspects to the community. This is another nice flowchart that is discovered in the literature, where Lin and others, as I mentioned before, are looking at aspects of how to come to terms to how the outstanding universal value will be actually impacted by World Heritage. You know, we see flash floods affecting sites, we see wildfires, how those wildfires actually affect the site, and can we come to terms that the outstanding universal values and those criteria that were identified originally from that site might disappear in the verge of climate change. So also, when we are in the disasters, maybe we need to look at build back better. So, but build back better might also meet terms of understanding those traditional construction techniques that might be able to help us. So by looking a little bit closer to vulnerability approaches, we need to engage with the stakeholders. We need to assess the current vulnerability, estimate the future conditions, estimate the future vulnerability, and make decisions and implementations that are not only important to the site as a World Heritage outstanding universal value, but also as the community values affect. So I won't be going into details because there are better experts and better lectures about defining scenarios, but the scenarios are always important to be able to understand what particular aspects are going to be happening to World Heritage. And I don't think that there has been a lot of studies. Most of the studies are raising the awareness of climate change, but most of the studies are not addressing actually the change that undoubtedly will happen there. So we have different types of scenarios, like synthetic scenarios, analog scenarios, but those scenarios should be there, also developed for World Heritage sites. This is a very simple climate model that I took from one of the academies, where you can see the carbon emissions, the CO2 concentration, and the temperature. And these can be very helpful and technical to understand those impacts on those particular sites. Obviously, there are many limitations to any plans. For instance, there is incentive and impediments to demolition that need to focus. For instance, in Canada, we tend to go for demolition because sometimes it's easier to demolish than to adaptive reuse. It's cheaper. So we need to look at how can we not only look at the immediate benefits of new constructions, but also looking at how existing buildings disposal after demolition actually affect the overall impact of climate change. So one example of climate adaptation of cultural sites is the Karachi City Historic Core, where low-income women were trained on ancient terracotta draft and ultimately producing over 150,000 cobbles, which become a source of livelihood while also reducing the urban flooding through the expanded use of porous pavements in that particular city. So very creative uses of traditional knowledge can have both a social and economical impact that will allow to a certain degree to adapt to climate change. And in that respect, just to kind of talk about an aspect that is very close to us is adaptive reuse. So how can we, basically reduce and retrofit existing buildings that would actually have a substantial reduction of embodied carbon emissions compared to new constructions, such as 70% to 85%. So if we only look at North America, we have a lot of buildings. We have about 235 billion square meters. And we have many World Heritage sites which are located in historic cities. How can we, actually have better adaptive reuse strategies to be able to mitigate those greenhouse gases and the carbon emissions? For instance, we have that definition of embodied carbon, that carbon footprint of materials. We see that there is very little tools to understand what is actually the embodied carbon of the footprint of an existing building and how, future adaptive reuse strategies would actually be able to reduce that embodied carbon. We always look mostly at the operational carbon. The operational carbon obviously is there. We can calculate very easily. It's the greenhouse gas emissions resulting, from the use of energy. But we tend to forget that existing buildings in World Heritage properties, etc., are there. They are protected. How can we make use of these buildings for new future functions? For instance, as we understand, around 70% of the federal buildings in Canada, the buildings owned by the federal government, will be disposed in the next decade. How can we get those buildings to be transformed to other uses rather than to demolish them and make new constructions? So environmental impacts avoided by making the choice of adaptive reuse are really important. Definitions such as the use of life cycle analysis, where we also concentrate on the starting calculation of embodied carbon, are very, very useful. And there are some tools. These are some available tools in the horizon. We have, for instance, the Athena Sustainable Materials Institute that have developed different tools. These tools are useful, but some of these tools are actually not developed for historic buildings. The APT, the Association for Preservation Technology, has been using the OSCAR system for adaptive reuse, and then the Hyper Atlas from Europe is a project which has been using, practical advice for the renovation of historic buildings, are kind of tools that are able to help us in that aspect. CARE is a new tool developed in the United States, where you can, understand the different scenarios of doing adaptive reuse of existing buildings to understand the embodied or the carbon impact of adaptive reuse compared to new constructions, and this could be some tools. Now, to kind of conclude, I know I have been talking a lot of messages, and I have been trying to give you an overview of how these different aspects of construction, etc., and to relation to World Heritage. I just wanted to mention some of the emerging tools that are there, which I find really interesting. For instance, this is the PhD of Nam Bai from the TU Delft in the Netherlands. I had the opportunity to review this PhD, in which he's using artificial intelligence to understand the heritage values and perceptions of people using social media algorithms, and can be used, to understand, to kind of engage the understanding and engage with social inclusion in using, artificial intelligence tools. Or for instance, the work of Iñácolo from the MIT lab, the Media Lab of MIT, in which he has developing what they call the Tourist Service Index, that uses artificial intelligence, deep learning algorithms, tackling different databases from Venice, but also from Airbnb, transportation, TripAdvisors, to understand the impact of, visitors to Venice, that would allow you to somehow make policymakers to understand uncontrolled areas. And then finally, the work of Calas and other emerging professionals, where you use artificial intelligence to understand the damage in buildings. This is a project that was done using digital data collected with drones after the blast in Beirut. And I was thinking that actually artificial intelligence could also allow us to determine the potential impacts of climate change if we are able to feed clear information to algorithms about World Heritage sites. And I think that this is a field that maybe we could exploit in the future with some of our, academic partners in the initiative. So to conclude, I want to leave you with some ideas. This is a project that we developed with a partnership of different organizations, in which we make this report for the World Heritage Convention about the transformational impacts of information technology for the nomination process, monitoring, interpretation and presentation, and community and city engagement in the use of technologies for World Heritage. And then to get involved, I will invite you, all of you, to become members of ICOMOS. For those of you that are in Canada, you can basically go to our website and become a member of ICOMOS Canada. And if you become a member of ICOMOS Canada, then you can become a member of our Climate Action Working Group of ICOMOS, in which we are actively developing, equity toolkits for climate justice. We have this report called The Future of Our Past, Engaging Cultural Heritage in Climate Action, that was published in 2019. And we are very active in the international scene, trying to focus how to bring the aspects of cultural heritage in climate change. And from Carleton, we are part of this initiative called HECA, Heritage Education for Climate Adaptation. And in this framework, we have organized 3 webinars, and there will be a 4th webinar launch next year. And it's these 3 webinars, which are available on this link down in this slide. You can watch this active initiative in trying to bring education, educational institutions to the issues of climate change, because in our opinion, there is very little training to emerging professionals about the impacts of climate to cultural heritage. And we have been trying to develop some discussion about that. But also very important, in our portal, you can see our section on resources, and we have identified a lot of publications that deal with the issues of climate adaptation, climate mitigation in terms of cultural heritage. And finally, there is a call to action for the Climate Heritage Network, where ICOMOS is part of it and other organizations, in which we're calling, in COP28, to understand that culture is at the heart of the climate action, as Catherine was mentioning in her opening remarks. And now with this, I would like to, leave some time for questions, and I really thank you for your attention and looking forward to the discussion. So thank you very much, and this is all from my side. And I hope that I didn't really go over the 9 minutes. So Catherine, back to you.
Yeah, I think that works. Thank you, Mario. That was quite fascinating. It was a quick romp. I think I would like to have given you 2 hours to present that presentation, because there was a lot of material in it. And I, just to pick out a few of the highlights. Clearly, we're all talking about heritage being part of the solution to climate change, which I think, a lot of people feel that heritage gets in the way, but I think it really is something that can be leveraged to help us move forward. I was really taken with your discussion earlier on about the personal aspects of the cultural sites. Having been to Abu Simbel and seeing the beautiful temple that was rescued and moved to there, of course, I don't think anyone mentioned, or I certainly didn't give one thought to the Nubians who were displaced with that kind of action. And of course, you also point to places that we're familiar with, like Quebec City and Venice, as places where people live. So we are surrounded by our heritage, and things are being affected by climate change. So we all need to be part of the solution. So what I'd like to do is ensure that people who are on this presentation, have listened to Mario, will drop some questions into the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen, and we'll take the last few minutes of this session to answer some of them. So I am going to open up the Q&A here, and I see we have one question so far, which I will read out, and Mario, perhaps you can address it for us. To preserve heritage sites that can withstand the forces of the Anthropocene, it seems necessary for humanity to build viable cultures of sustainability across the globe. Do you have a sense of potential future cultural scenarios, either regional or global, that are both scientifically viable and ethically desirable, i.e. based on equality for all? That's a long question.
Yes, and I think that question will take me maybe for 2 hours to answer, but I will try to do it in a few minutes. I think that, I mean, I would say that that's more a question for all of us, because can we come to terms that these outstanding, so obviously, you know, when we preserve the Abu Simbel temples, as Catherine was saying, you know, we were trying to preserve the material culture of those temples and try to preserve them for the future. But we know that with climate change, obviously, you know, humidity is something that is happening. It affects, you know, lime mortar, lime-based stones, etc. Can we come to terms that things will get damaged more? And can we come to terms that things might disappear? And I think that's a bigger question. So can we say that these criteria of the World Heritage Convention will actually need to change in the verge of climate change? Because we cannot statically pretend to conserve them. And that from one side. And the other side is, can we actually justify the conservation of these sites, which might be very costly, despite of the communities that live there, right? So are we talking about equity? So I think that that's why when we look at sites, we need to see that, you know, for instance, I was working a lot in Petra in Jordan. I know that Petra is basically, is symbiotic to the community there, right? If there is no Petra, there is no economy for the people that live there, visitors, etc. So obviously we need to protect the site. Obviously we need to make understand visitors, etc., the sensitivity to the change of climate change, but we need to be aware of what is going to happen. And I think that we as heritage experts, sometimes we have neglected to understand what is going to happen. And many of my colleagues do it, but I have to say, sometimes I'm like, no, I don't want this building to collapse or to be submerged, but it's going to be, and it's going to happen. So how can we come into terms to that? Okay, so I think it's a big question. I don't know. I think equity plays a big role, but I'm sorry, from my humble architect/engineer, I'm not really, I'm humanistic, but not to the biggest extent. I know there is a lot to say to equity, and I know that there will be better people talking about that. But I hope I answered to a certain degree the question. You're muted, Catherine.
All right, thank you, Mario. I needed that help. So another question has come in is asking, what is the best way to conduct the adaptive reuse, considering many of the heritage sites are facing the investment pressures due to visitors?
Well, you know, I think, there are two aspects there. I think that adaptive reuse, by all means, is cheaper, climatically speaking, right? Many people might say it's very expensive to, you know, adaptive reuse, very sophisticated. If we have places with marble that came from Italy, we're not going to bring that material back from Italy, right? But equally important, I think, is to understand that we have, we cannot tolerate sites being demolished. And where is this waste going? We cannot tolerate anymore that people are not going to reuse construction materials. We cannot tolerate more that people might say that, this building is, like the HVAC system or the ventilation system is no longer of use. I think that we need to be smarter than that. And I think that that's what it goes at adaptive reuse. Now, visitor pressures, obviously, we need control. And control means sometimes we need to give up some revenue. I was in Italy over the spring, and I was just impressed by the number of people going to Rome, for instance. We were in Rome and Florence. Just impressed by the amount of people and the lack of quality of tourism infrastructure. And I'm sorry, I don't want to bring this into aspect, to blame anyone, but I think it's important that we have a new conscience about sites, that we as visitors need to understand that we are having an impact. And sometimes I was reading another article when I was preparing to this lecture, talking about people visiting, sites in Jasper, in Canada, because they think that that place is going to disappear of climate change. So that already is bringing a lot of visitors impact, no? So it's going to disappear, I need to go before it disappears. God says it's going to disappear if you continue going in that volume, right? So how to come to terms to that?
Thank you, Mario. I have a question for you.
Yeah.
And it relates to the role of I guess UNESCO overseeing World Heritage Sites. And I know when people do things to World Heritage Sites, there are threats that they can lose their designation, and I guess be removed from the World Heritage List. But how are sites that are in well, anywhere in the world actually managed and monitored? For instance, while you were in Italy, I guess I was in Cyprus in the spring, and you mentioned Paphos, but we were also in the Troodos Mountains, where there are at least 10 World Heritage Site painted churches, which some of them are 800 years old with amazing frescoes, and some of them are very well guarded and presented to visitors by the local clergy. Others were little tiny buildings in the middle of nowhere, no climate controls, susceptible obviously to climate change and variations in climate normally, where you could just push open the door, see these magnificent frescoes if we used our phones to illuminate the site. Otherwise you couldn't see anything. So how do we record those and make sure that those are protected? And if they're allowed to fall apart, where are the records going to be?
Well, I don't want to talk on behalf of UNESCO, obviously, because I'm not part of UNESCO, but I have been working a lot I was part of UNESCO a long time ago. So I think that obviously the responsibility of World Heritage Sites, resides on the country, right? So if we as Canadians do not protect our sites, and the Canadian government is not protecting the sites, then it's our responsibility towards the international community, because we made a commitment with UNESCO to protect them and with the world. So I think that people have to understand it's not UNESCO or this international body, is us as we elect our people, and these people elect our people that manage the sites. To a certain degree, it's on us, right? But obviously, there are mechanisms to monitor the sites. UNESCO is an array of countries, right? We have different countries with different set of values, different ways of doing things, and we all have to come to terms. And that's the international community. People are often frustrated by United Nations, and I always say, well, guys, but that's what it is. We have the United Nations, we have UNESCO, we have organizations that represent all of us, but we all have to agree. And sometimes it's difficult to agree. It's not because of the organization, it's because who are the members of that organization and how do they react? And change has to come from the countries. Now, what you say about documentation, obviously, I don't want to say that the digital record or documentation will replace sites, but we can document sites. Like, for instance, the work that we were doing in Paphos was mostly aimed at the shelters. So designing new shelters for the mosaics that the Getty was working with the Cypriot government, and also for the evacuation of rainwater in the area. So the idea was to create records for the management and the conservation of the site. And I think that that's really important. Obviously, those records can be stored in different places, but that will be part of another discussion, because that's my field, right? Documentation and archiving digitally. I can talk about that for ages, but I don't know if I would have the time today. but glad to follow up on that discussion.
Well, thank you. I think that is something worthwhile following up on. And I see that we're coming close to the end, so perhaps I can thank you, Mario. That was really quite fascinating. And I'm sure more people will be able to take part in it once the recording is up. And there's another couple of comments that have come in, but maybe Francesco can share those with you and we can get some answers out. So Francesco, I'll just turn it back to you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Yeah, I would just like to echo Catherine's thanks to you, Mario, for coming to present today. It was a fascinating presentation and very, very insightful. Catherine, thank you so much for moderating today. And thank you to everyone who was able to attend. We obviously put these sessions together for the audience to be able to come and participate and learn. So thank you so much for taking the time to be here today, for asking questions and participating in the discussion. There are a couple of there's a question and a comment in the chat, but I will share that with you later, Mario. So yes, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. And just to remind everybody, this is a bi-weekly seminar series, so there will be another session on December 18th, which will be our last session for this year. So thank you again to everybody. Have a great rest of your days.